This mini lecture is just going to briefly touch on some of the highlights of interesting biological aspects of birds. It can by no means do this very large and diverse group justice, but I will try and hit some highlights here. This, of course, should be done in concert with reading the appropriate chapters in the book and watching any assigned videos. And who knows, maybe at some point you've been called a bird brain, but really birds, the more they've been studied, the more they've been appreciated for their enormous processing capabilities, even though they have a relatively small brain compared to their body size. Most of the skull of a bird is actually taken up with eyes. Sometimes those eyes even almost touch each other in the front. So, the kind of the classic view shown here was that birds were not very capable, sorry, we're looking down here, not very capable of higher order thought, that most of their brain was comprised of, kind of very instinctive behavior, meaning they were very what we called hardwired. They would just have one response to something, and that they weren't capable of a lot of learning compared to, say, the human brain, where they had more pallial parts of their brain that were considered more complex, and you have higher cognitive processing abilities. But now what really has come to light in the past few years is this kind of modern view here, that their brains just are different than ours. The amount of and types of neurons and types of processing in the brain is distributed differently than it is with ours. You can see here on ours, the higher order processing is going on kind of on the larger parts on the outside of the brain, whereas the whole part, or 2/3 of the brain of the bird, that's what's going on. So even though it's smaller, there's a couple things going on. One of the main things is that the density and size of the neurons in these areas is just super packed in. So if you take a similar size area in a bird brain and a mammal brain, you will find many, many more types and densities of neurons. And so, the proportion of neurons in the forebrains is actually higher in birds. And so they are just doing their processing in slightly different ways in different areas of the brain compared to us. And they are not as hardwired as the classic view kind of pointed out. And this is really important for birds. There's a lot of things they need to do. I don't know if any of you have ever fed wild birds or jays. They can take peanuts and hide them and find them months later. Acorn woodpeckers, woodpeckers in general that cache things, they can hide things and find them much later. That takes a whole lot of memory. There's a lot of learning. The songs are very complex, and some of them are kind of hardwired, but some of them are also involved in learning as well. Some of the other unique aspects of biology that I wanted to point out are that birds see the world differently than us. We have what's called a trichromatic distribution in our vision. We have 3 types of color receptors, red, green, and blue here, RGB. And in fact, if you're ever messing around with colors on your computer, you'll see that you can alter the red, green, and blue. That's based on the fact that we have these 3 primary receptors. And so that allows us to perceive certain light frequencies in our environment. But birds have all that plus a bag of chips. They actually have a 4th receptor in their eyes that is capable of picking up either highly violet colors, or they can even go down in the ultraviolet colors. So they can see things that we cannot see, and they perceive the world a lot differently. And I've put a few examples up here, whereas we might look at this bird and see that it's mostly black and see a little bit of iridescence. This UV and violet radiation that's being reflected off this bird to another bird is in fact super colorful. So there are a lot of species where we used to say, oh, there's no distinction between the males and females, but really, that was just kind of naive on our part, in that there very often is, we just can't see it. Things like how they see their eggs is very different. How they perceive vegetation in the environment is very different. So there's a whole quarter of the visionary world that they are receiving. You know, the mouth patterns of the babies sometimes have UV reflectance. You've maybe all seen pictures of flowers when thinking about insects, and their landing pads on flowers that are in the UV waves, but we can't see. One interesting thing that some people have done with this is they have come up with little reflective items you can put on your windows that we really can't see because it's not in our visual spectrum, but the birds can see it, and that reduces the impacts of birds on buildings. In fact, thousands and thousands of birds die each year from impacts, not just with our house windows, but in very large buildings. You know, there's just a huge killing that occurs. And so now architects are starting to build in UV sheeting, or even, you know, like UV lines that are in the glazing or the glass of the windows themselves, so that birds can now see it, but it doesn't affect how we perceive it. And kind of going hand in hand with this UV perception is the vast diversity of color that birds can have in their feathers. You know, here is kind of our typical idea of feathers. You know, we might see variations in colors. You know, obviously the peacock tail is very beautiful to us, as is the gorget, or this area of a male hummingbird. You know, these colors are very mechanical, and there's different origins of them, but this is just an inkling of what the birds are actually picking up. But there are, you know, a lot of different compounds that can be put into feathers by birds. Some of these are diet-based. Some of them are metabolized from other precursors. So there's melanins, which is responsible for a lot of the browns. Carotenoids are items birds can put in that add often a lot of red and orange and yellow. And then porphyrins kind of help with some of the metallic sheen coloration, in addition to the physical way the feathers are created. And so, you know, a lot of copying of bird feathers has gone on to help improve, you know, human products themselves. Birds are also really good at hearing. That's probably not a shocker, right? They use a lot of song for communication, and so they have pretty acute hearing. Even though their cochlea is really tiny, you know, it's about a tenth of the size of ours, they have, even, you know, in just a centimeter of their ear canal compared to ours, about 10 times the number of hearing cells. So that aids them in picking up sound and identifying them. And the sounds, you know, carry a lot of different information. It can be the sex of the animal. It can be whether or not it's a territorial display. It could be a, hey buddy, get out of my territory. You know, so they have lots of different calls that can be aimed at attracting a mate, or protecting an area, or shushing your babies. Like there'll be certain calls where the moms or the dads will just say, hey, snip it, you know, you're going to get eaten. You know, baby birds are very noisy, so it does not behoove them to always be noisy. And what's interesting is, even within a species, you can often have a lot of regional variation, and that's what this figure from your book is showing. So we have, you know, just one species here, one sparrow, and depending on where you go in California, so here's Lake Tahoe, just for orientation. If you've ever been up the Eastern Sierras, you know, different passes, Mammoth Lakes, if you record the sound of the call in these different locations, you can see from their sonogram, which is what's showing here. So this is a visual representation of what the call sounds like. There's a lot of variability, but this is all still within the same species. This actually is not a whole lot of variability compared to something like a mockingbird, which their calls, especially the male mating calls, they will pick up all sorts of information from their environment. When I was a grad student living in Los Angeles, there was actually a mockingbird that lived around our neighborhood that learned car alarms. And, you know, you don't have so many car alarms nowadays, but back in the 90s, you know, this was a big thing. And the car alarms would be very distinctive, like beep, 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 woo, 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 eh, eh, eh. You know, you probably recognize that from movies. these mockingbirds would pick this up, and it would sound, for all intents and purposes, the same as that. What was frustrating is they would decide to call at midnight or later from the tree outside your house. So perhaps someone once went out there with a hose and chased the bird away because they couldn't sleep. Anyways, some birds, such as owls, that really rely on hearing for their hunting purposes, have this crazy arrangement in that one ear is actually higher than the other. And this allows them, when a sound is coming in, it's going to reach one ear faster than it's going to reach the other ear. And they can distinguish between the two based on this just millisecond or more difference where that sound came from in the environment. And so they also may have ruffs around their head, like big areas of feathers that help increase their reception of these sounds. And also, in addition to hearing, they're very vocal creatures. They have a syrinx, which is basically kind of a fancy vocal box, in their throats at the base of the trachea, and they can make all sorts of different sounds. Birds, in terms of mating systems, sometimes you always hear about birds mating for life. It turns out, after a lot of study, that that really isn't true. There are very few birds that actually do mate for life, unless one or the other dies, and that never sneak out on their mates. Some species of swans are ones that will actually do that, and they'll mate year after year. Sometimes they stay together the whole year, sometimes they'll separate and they'll come back together. What really seems to be the more common pattern is mating or bonding, but with what's called EPC. So this is EPC, or extra pair copulation, meaning that you might have a male that is bonded with a female, and they may be building a nest together and raising babies together, but this male at the same time may be sneaking off and mating with other females, even though he's not helping provision their chicks. His ladies on the side here are still interested in mating with him for his genes. And so they're willing to kind of go it on their own just to get access to his genes. You can have the same thing with the females. The females may be bonded to a certain male, but while he's off gathering materials for the nest, she may sneak out and mate with other males. These sneaky males will come into maybe the dominant male's territory and call or even be quiet, and the female will mate with him. So in fact, you might have a clutch of eggs that has several different fathers in it. And so, this is still considered monogamy, but it's a different kind. This is called social monogamy versus this is kind of more traditional monogamy. Outside of the monogamous approaches, you also have polygyny and polyandry. Polygyne, so think gynecology, many females. Androgyny, androgens, many males, okay? So in polygyny, you have one male with many females, or polyandry, you have one female with many males. And this is probably the rarest of the situations. Our local house wrens, which I was listening to call this morning around my house, he might have a harem of females that he is assisting. There are mating systems called leks, where the males will arrive at kind of a breeding ground in advance of the females. They will set up little territories, and then they will display, and the females will come and check out the various males. And so, this one female may check out a variety of males in this one area, but she'll select one to mate with. And what's really interesting is some females will pick other males that more males are mating with. So it's, it's almost like they say, well, she thinks that one's sexy or possibly good genes, so I'm going to mate with him because he's popular. Sound familiar? We see this, to some degree, even in humans. You could almost call like bar scenes, in a way, lecking. There's a lot of males showing off for the females. The females come in and check out the action. In many of these systems, the females may still be raising the chicks on their own, or it you can have social choice in some of these different systems. In polyandry, here, let me erase the link. In polyandry, there's a few, especially the jacana, where a female will mate with a male, lay eggs, and then leave the male with the nest. And then she'll go and mate with another male, lay eggs, and then leave him to raise the nest. And that's the jacana. So, you know, she does none of the raising of the chicks herself, but he does. And you might ask, well, why? Why not go and mate with other females? Well, if he leaves the eggs and the female's not coming back, then all of the eggs will die. So he is really stuck in this, this situation. So a lot of breeding diversity in terms of their mating systems. In terms of reproduction, you know, you know, at one point in their history, they had 2 oviducts, but in modern birds, the right one is vestigial, and now we just have one, the left. You know, they'll have eggs at different stages of development in the ovary. They'll travel down the oviduct, get fertilized from sperm, so that may be recent sperm, or some females can store sperm. The egg will start to be put together, and then the shell is put on kind of at the last stage before it comes out the cloaca by the shell gland. You know, in terms of sex determination, largely gametic. It's similar in that it's heterogamy in terms of determining the sex, but it's a little different than what we're familiar with humans. So in birds, it's the same, the homogametic combination is the male. So having 2 copies of the Z chromosome is what makes a male. In the females, you have a Z and a W. So in humans, it would be XY that would be male and XX would be female. So it's actually kind of flipped. There is some indication that in certain species, you know, temperature might be able to affect the sex to some degree, largely, you know, working more through hormones and such. But the vast majority is this ZZ-ZW system. And of course, you know, nesting is one of the most interesting aspects of birds. I'm going to post a video on all about nests and different types of nests. Very diverse, from, you know, no nest, just sitting on the ground, to elaborate nests. You know, I've been watching little Anna's hummingbird in my backyard this season build her nest, and they will get all sorts of material. They'll get spider webs, leaves, and such, build this little cup nest. Some are very social and group nesters, like sociable weavers. They will build these gigantic nests that have many entrances all together. You know, this is beneficial for looking out for predators, but also these are known to catch fire. It's actually pretty sad. And then you might have more aquatic nesters. They might nest out on the water to reduce predation. So huge variety in nest structure and type, as well as the mating system.